The ring was still on her finger. That was what the forensic examiner noted first, in the cold clinical language of a report that tried its best to describe something that resisted clinical language entirely. A gold band. Simple, plain, the kind a man buys at a jewelry counter when he doesn't have much money, but means every word he says. It had been on her finger for 16 years, through everything, through what happened in that basement and the 16 years that followed. It had never left her hand. The woman who wore it was Darlene Mae Puckett, 37 years old, a church organist from a small town outside Cookeville in Putnam County, Tennessee. She had been missing since the autumn of 2007, since the evening she drove to a neighbor's property to return a borrowed canning pot, and never came back. Her husband, Glenn, had given her that ring on the steps of the Cookeville courthouse in 1991. She had worn it every day for 16 years without taking it off, because that was the kind of woman she was. The kind who honored the things that mattered by never setting them down. The ring did not leave her hand. The basement did not give her up. Not for 16 years. It would take a burst water pipe, a contractor hired to assess the damage, and a man named Earl Drury, who had lived quietly on Stanton Road in Putnam County since before Darlene Puckett was ever reported missing, to finally end the waiting that Glenn Puckett and his 2 daughters had been doing since a cold October evening when the canning pot came home. But Darlene did not. But before we get to that pipe and that basement and what Earl Drury thought 16 years of silence meant, we have to go back to Putnam County in the autumn of 2007. We have to go back to who Darlene was and what she had built in that quiet, specific way that people build lives in small Tennessee towns, carefully, without ceremony, by showing up every single day for the people who needed them. Cookeville in the mid-2000s was the kind of place that older Tennesseans described with a particular pride. A real town, they would say, meaning a town that hadn't yet surrendered everything to the interstate and the chain restaurants and the gradual homogenization of small American places. It had a hardware store run by the same family since 1958. It had a diner on East Broad Street where the booths were the same burgundy vinyl they had always been. It had Tennessee Tech University, which gave it a certain density and vitality without changing what it fundamentally was. A community in which people had last names that other people recognized, where you could still describe yourself by who your people were and have that mean something. The Pucketts were Cookeville people going back 2 generations. Glenn had grown up there, gone to work at a distribution center outside town after high school, married Darlene Rayburn in 1991 when they were both 21 and had known each other since the 7th grade. They had 2 daughters, Tamara, born 1993, and Claire, born 1995. They lived in a modest house on Cedar Gap Road, wood frame with a covered front porch, where Glenn kept a metal glider that creaked pleasantly, and where they sat most summer evenings watching the light go off the hills. Darlene had been the organist at Olive Hill Baptist Church for 11 years by 2007. She had learned to play on a second-hand upright piano her parents kept in the living room, had taught herself to read music from a library book when she was 11 years old, and had moved to the church organ at 19 when the previous organist retired and nobody else could fill the seat. She played every Sunday morning, every Wednesday evening service, every funeral the church held, every Christmas program. The congregation had grown so accustomed to her playing that in the weeks after she disappeared, several members said later, the silence at the organ bench during services felt like an absence with physical weight, like something had been removed from the room that the room didn't know how to compensate for. She taught piano lessons on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons in the front room of the Cedar Gap Roadhouse. 7 students, ranging from age 6 to age 14, paying $12 per half-hour session, which she saved in a mason jar in the kitchen cabinet for family vacation money. She had a gift for teaching children who were afraid of making mistakes. She told them that wrong notes were just questions the music was asking, and that the answer was always to play the next note. She had a garden. Tomatoes and green beans in the back, zinnias along the front walk, a row of canning jars on a shelf in the kitchen from the previous summer's work. She believed in being prepared. She believed in not wasting things. She had borrowed a canning pot from her neighbor on Stanton Road, Earl Drury, earlier that week because hers had developed a hairline crack. She meant to return it on October 18, 2007, on her way back from picking Claire up from volleyball practice. The pot went with her when she left the house at 5:40 p.m. Glenn kissed her at the door. That was the last time he saw her. Claire's volleyball practice ended at 6:15 p.m. Darlene was not in the parking lot when the team came out of the gymnasium. Coach Patricia Elmore waited with Claire until 6:45, then called the Puckett house. Glenn answered. He had assumed Darlene had been delayed at Drury's property. He called Earl Drury's landline at 6:52 p.m. No answer. He drove Claire to Stanton Road himself. Drury's house was dark. Darlene's car, a 1999 Pontiac Grand Am, navy blue, was not there. The canning pot was not on Drury's porch. There was no note. Glenn drove the road between Stanton Road and the school twice, in each direction. Nothing. At 8:30 p.m., Glenn Puckett called the Putnam County Sheriff's Office. The deputy who responded that night, a young man 2 years on the job named Deputy Craig Wills, noted the information, asked the standard questions, and told Glenn that adults who had been missing less than 24 hours were generally not yet designated as endangered missing. He told him to call back in the morning if she hadn't returned. Glenn Puckett stood in his kitchen with the phone in his hand after the call ended and looked at the mason jar of piano lesson money on the shelf, and understood, with the particular clarity of a person whose world has just shifted beneath their feet, that the morning was not going to bring her back. By 10 p.m., Glenn had called Darlene's parents, her sister in Sparta, 3 of her closest friends from church. Nobody had heard from her. The following morning, the Pontiac Grand Am was found on a county road a quarter mile from the Stanton Road turnoff, parked on the gravel shoulder with the engine off and the keys on the driver's seat. The canning pot was in the back seat. It had not been delivered. Earl Drury, interviewed at his property later that morning, told the responding detective that Darlene had never arrived. He had not been home the prior evening. He had been at his brother's house in Monterey. His brother confirmed it. The canning pot in the back seat established that Darlene had not even reached Drury's driveway before something intervened. She had stopped, or been stopped, on that quarter-mile stretch of county road. Nothing had been left behind to explain why, except one thing, logged quietly into evidence on the second day. A partial boot print in the soft gravel shoulder near the driver's side of the car, too large to be Darlene's, pressed deep enough to suggest someone had stood there with weight and purpose. That boot print. The lead investigator on the Darlene Puckett case was Detective Sergeant Vera Kane of the Putnam County Sheriff's Office, a 20-year veteran who had been born in Putnam County and intended to die there, and who brought to the case the particular intensity of someone investigating a disappearance in the community where she herself had grown up. She knew Olive Hill Baptist. She had attended a recital there when her daughter was studying piano. She may have heard Darlene play. Kane worked the early weeks with focused urgency. The Pontiac was processed thoroughly. Road searches were conducted in a 5-mile radius. The TBI, the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, was brought in to assist by the 3rd week. Earl Drury was interviewed twice. He was 61 years old, a retired county road maintenance worker who had lived alone on Stanton Road since his wife left him in 2002. His alibi for the evening of October 18th at his brother's in Monterey was confirmed across multiple interviews with the brother and a neighbor who had seen his truck in Monterey that evening. He was cooperative, expressed concern, offered to assist with the search. He was eliminated from active suspicion. The investigation then turned to a man named Carl Tinsley, who had been involved in a verbal dispute with Glenn Puckett at a gas station 2 months prior over a parking disagreement, a trivial incident that had been reported to local police and documented. Tinsley had no prior criminal record and no apparent connection to Darlene. But in the absence of stronger leads, Detective Kane pursued the angle. She investigated Tinsley for 6 weeks before determining, through multiple witness confirmations and a cell tower record placing him in Knoxville on the evening of October 18th, that he had no involvement in the disappearance. 6 weeks. The case had been burning for 6 weeks before that path was closed. Meanwhile, Glenn Puckett had taken Claire and Tamara to stay with Darlene's parents while he returned to work, because there was no practical alternative, and because standing still made the fear larger. He kept Darlene's piano lesson schedule on the refrigerator. He did not cancel the students, because he could not bring himself to act as though she was not coming back. The 7 students kept their Tuesday and Thursday slots for 3 months, arriving and leaving. Some of them with their parents, who held Glenn's hand in the doorway and said nothing useful because there was nothing useful to say. By February 2008, 5 months in, Detective Vera Kane documented the case as inactive pending new information. She wrote in her concluding memo that the investigation had produced no physical evidence connecting any specific individual to the disappearance, that the boot print recovered at the scene had been insufficiently resolved for comparison purposes, and that the case would remain open but was not currently yielding investigative traction. She did not close the file. She kept a copy in her desk. She kept it there for the next 15 years. By 2012, 5 years had passed. Claire Puckett was 17 and played on the same volleyball team her mother had driven her home from the night she disappeared. Tamra was 19 and had enrolled at Tennessee Tech, 3 miles from the house where she grew up. Glenn went to work and came home and sat on the metal glider on the front porch in the evenings and watched the light go off the hills, the way he and Darlene had sat there, and he did it alone. The piano in the front room was still there. Glenn had never touched it. The 7 students had found other teachers by spring of 2008. The mason jar was still on the kitchen shelf, the vacation money still inside, because moving it would have meant deciding something that Glenn was not prepared to decide. Vera Kane had made detective lieutenant by 2014 and was supervising the cold case unit she had helped establish, one of the first formal cold case operations in Putnam County. She reviewed the Puckett file 3 times over the years, in 2009, in 2013, and in 2018, each time with the same result. The evidence was insufficient for new leads, without new information. The boot print had been documented, but could not be matched without a comparison sample. The case needed something it didn't have. Earl Drury had continued to live on Stanton Road. He had grown a small garden in his backlot. He had attended the same church he'd always attended. He had, twice in the years after Darlene's disappearance, brought casseroles to Glenn Puckett's house during holidays, the way neighbors do. Glenn had thanked him and set the dishes inside and closed the door. In the summer of 2022, a section of water supply pipe beneath Drury's basement developed a slow leak that went undetected through the fall and into the winter. By January 2023, the damage to the foundation was sufficient to require assessment, and Drury hired a contractor out of Cookeville named Doug Mercer to evaluate the extent of the problem. On January 9, 2023, Doug Mercer went into Earl Drury's basement. He came back out, walked to his truck, sat behind the wheel for a moment, and then called 911. Every case on this channel begins with weeks of work, cross-referencing records, verifying timelines, making sure the people at the center of these stories are treated with the care they deserve. If you want us to keep uncovering the truth behind cases like Darlene's, please take a second to like and subscribe. Drop a comment letting us know where in the world you're watching from. Now, let's go back to that basement. The Putnam County Sheriff's Office arrived at Stanton Road at 11:42 a.m. On January 9, 2023, Detective Lieutenant Vera Kane was notified at 11:51. She was at the scene by 12:20 p.m. She was 63 years old. She had been carrying this case for 15 years. What the forensic team recovered from the prepared area beneath the basement's northeast corner, beneath a layer of concrete poured over a false floor, the kind of pour that could be distinguished from the original foundation work by the color difference in the aggregate, and a joint line that had been covered with paint and, over 16 years, nearly forgotten, was confirmed through dental records within 48 hours. The gold ring was documented in the evidence log as Item 3. On the second day of the examination, the boot print cast from the County Road shoulder in October 2007, still in evidence storage, documented and preserved, was compared against boot prints recovered from the basement. The comparison was completed by the TBI Forensic Lab. The match was confirmed on January 14, 2023. Detective Kane made the call to the Putnam County District Attorney's Office herself. She sat at her desk in the sheriff's office, the same desk where she had kept a copy of the case file for 15 years. And she held the phone and said the words, and then she sat very still for a moment before she got up and went to find Glenn Puckett's number. Earl Drury had not been in Monterey on the evening of October 18, 2007. His brother, interviewed again in January 2023 in light of the forensic findings, recanted the alibi he had provided in 2007. He said he had lied for his brother because his brother had asked him to, and he had not known, or had not let himself know, what he was covering. He said 16 years had been long enough. He was 72 years old, and 16 years had been more than long enough. Drury had been a neighbor. He had borrowed the same canning pot to Darlene as a reason for contact. His landline had gone unanswered on the evening of the 18th, because he was not in Monterey, and he was not in his house. His property was a quarter mile from where the Pontiac was found. The false floor in the northeast corner of the basement, when examined by construction experts, had been poured within a 4 to 6 week window of October 2007, using a mix that was distinct from the surrounding original concrete. He had brought casseroles to Glenn Puckett's door. Earl Drury was arrested at 7:15 a.m. on January 17, 2023, at a sister's home in Crossville, where he had relocated in the days after Doug Mercer made his call. 2 Putnam County deputies and a TBI agent found him in the kitchen. He did not come to the door voluntarily. When the deputies entered, he was standing with his back to the window, and he looked at Vera Kane when she walked in, and she looked back at him with the steadiness of a woman who had been waiting 15 years for this specific moment, and neither of them said anything for a long moment. He was charged with first-degree murder. He was held without bond. Glenn Puckett was told the news by Detective Kane in person at the Cedar Gap Roadhouse on the morning of the arrest. He sat at the kitchen table for a long time after she told him. The mason jar was still on the shelf. He looked at it. Then he looked at Kane and said, "She never stopped being here." At trial in the fall of 2023, the prosecution presented the forensic evidence, the boot print comparison, the recanted alibi, and the construction analysis of the false floor. The defense offered no credible counter-narrative. Drury was convicted of first-degree murder in October 2023 and sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. He made no statement. He had been silent about Darlene Puckett for 16 years, and he remained silent to the end. Darlene Mae Puckett was 37 years old. She played the organ at Olive Hill Baptist Church and told her piano students that wrong notes were questions the music was asking, and that the answer was always to play the next note. She had a front porch glider and a canning garden and a mason jar of piano lesson money on a kitchen shelf, and 2 daughters who looked like her. She had a husband who had kissed her at the door at 5:40 on a Thursday evening and had never stopped waiting. She was buried with the ring still on her finger, the way she had worn it for the previous 26 years, 16 of them in a basement on Stanton Road, 10 of them at rest. Glenn Puckett moved the mason jar from the kitchen shelf the week after the sentencing. He and Claire and Tamra drove to the Smoky Mountains for a long weekend, which was the vacation the money had always been for. The one Darlene had been saving toward in $12 increments in a jar she kept because she believed in being prepared and not wasting things. They ate at a diner in Gatlinburg. They sat on a porch in the evening and watched the light go off the mountains. Tamra said it was exactly the kind of place her mother would have loved. She was right. It was. Vera Kane retired from the Putnam County Sheriff's Office in March 2024, 4 months after the verdict. At her retirement gathering, the department gave her a framed photograph of the Cedar Gap Roadhouse in autumn. She hung it in her living room. She has looked at it most days since. There are questions in this case that belong to everyone who watched it. Do you believe Earl Drury's brother should face accountability for the alibi he provided in 2007? And if not, where does the line fall between loyalty and complicity in something like this? What does it tell us that Drury brought casseroles to Glenn Puckett's door in the years after? Was that cruelty, or the behavior of a man who had so thoroughly separated himself from what he had done that he genuinely did not feel it? And what do you think Glenn and his daughters found in that weekend in the Smokies? The kind of peace that comes from knowing, or something more complicated than peace? Leave your answers below. This community carries these questions with more care than most, and we read everything you write. Justice found Darlene Puckett after 16 years and a burst water pipe, and a contractor who made the right call when he came back up the stairs. Stories like hers exist because truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how deep it's buried or how long it waits. If you believe that too, subscribe so you don't miss the next case. More stories are in the description below. Thank you for watching.